to be considered for immediate adoption.
There are 3 resolutions to be presented for immediate adoption. File number 120220, resolution directing the City Controller to conduct an audit of the Police Department's crime reporting practices. File number 120250, resolution approving final certified survey maps. File number 120268, resolution approving an affidavit of correction relative to errors contained in documents for certified survey map number 8116, located on the north side of West Milwaukee Road and West South 36th Street in the 8th Automatic District.
The chair recognizes Alderman Willie Wade.
Thank you, Mr. President. Is it a reason why file number 120220 is immediate adoption and not going to a committee?
I can ask the sponsor of the legislation.
Yeah, quite. Thank you very much.
The chair recognizes Alderman Dudzik.
Quite simply, I believe that this is a time-sensitive issue. The answers that we may gain from this particular file might help us with regards to the budget coming later this year. There is a 90-day window that this particular file has on it, and again, that would give us plenty of time to perhaps adjust our spending with regards to the Milwaukee Police Department.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Alderman Wade, please continue. Yes.
I definitely agree with what is being proposed, but I'm not agreeing with immediate adoption. I think it should go to a committee. So could you list me as a no vote to that file number, please?
That's an appropriate motion. We'll let Alderman Wade reflect no vote. Item number 120220. The chair recognizes Alderman Puente.
Thank you, Mr. President. Record me as in opposition to file number 120220. The reason being is that I don't believe the City Comptroller has the expertise to really do this audit. I think there's going to be an outsource for them to do this, especially given the time restraints. When we're talking about thousands and thousands of reports here, I believe that the taxpayers of this city are going to feel a great impact as it pertains to the cost of this. I agree with Alderman Wade. This probably should go back to a committee and discussed at that point and see. The police department right now is doing their own internal audit. Again, we're jumping through hoops because somebody in the media said this was so. How much weight do we put on what one reporter reported? What was his resources? How did he obtain these type of stats? We don't know that. And for us to just randomly start saying we should do our own individual audit without having the expertise of the people to do it, and it's going to cost us, does not make any sense to me whatsoever. So I will oppose this.
Thank you. Let the record reflect Alderman Puente's objection to item number 120220. The chair recognizes Alderman Ball.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm a co-sponsor of the measure to seek an outside review, and I do support the provision to actually move forward and conduct an audit, albeit I do have concerns about moving forward here today. I think that there are really 2 things that must come into play, and the first is the timeline. I do not believe that 90 days would provide sufficient timeline to come back with an audit, and the second is the scope. I mean, are we talking about looking at individual police reports that were outlined by the newspaper? Are we talking about looking at a 1-month time frame, a 2-month time frame, a 6-month, a 3-month? I truly think that those are things that could and should be ironed out at committee with a potential report back even from the Comptroller's office as to how much the potential time, the cost, and other things that should be weighed into the entire equation. To simply ram it through, I don't think is appropriate. I do support doing this from an outside independent basis, but I think that those other issues should come into factor. And as opposed to actually not having this approved, I think it would be more appropriate to refer the matter back to committee, and I would be happy to move that at this time.
It's an appropriate motion. It supersedes the motion that is before us. I know there are a number of lights that are on. I don't know if there was a desire to speak to the previous motion or the current motion, but we're going to have discussion on the motion that's before us. The motion proffered by Alderman Bowe is to refer back to committee. On that particular motion, are there any discussions? The chair recognizes Alderwoman Cox.
Thank you, Mr. President. I, for one, am all for transparency and accountability within the police department for the citizens of the city of Milwaukee, and have done several pieces of legislation myself to help that come about. I do have a question based upon, I'm going to support the motion because I do think that there is more discussion that needs to be had, and that discussion is best had at committee. But even for what we will see at committee, there's been some suggestion that the capabilities of the comptroller's office may not be there to conduct this, and that it may have to be outsourced. I to the sponsors, if that is so, seeing this without a fiscal note is a concern to me. So even if this in itself is sent back to committee, I would hope that some greater evaluation of the financial impact to do such a audit is attached to it, so that we are well aware of any costs that may be incurred as a result of calling for this audit.
So there's a support to send back to committee. Again, the motion before us is to refer back to committee. On the motion to refer back to committee, the chair recognizes Alderman Terry Witkowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. I agree that it would be poor public policy to pass anything like this without adequate information. We do have a communication file coming before public safety that will address the internal audit, which should give us 6 years worth of data since the system was put in place, so we can compare the extent of the problem from year to year. I think questions on scope and the ability for a controller to audit can be addressed at that time, as well as any input from the Fire and Police Commission and the Executive Director. I do support the motion to send this to committee.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Alderman Joe Davis.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to be listed as a co-sponsor.
Let the record reflect Alderman Davis' desire to be a co-sponsor. Are there any objections by the current? Okay, none, so let the record reflect. Please continue, Alderman Davis.
And I think this item is very important for all of us to monitor. I would hope that more would jump on board to co-sponsor this piece of legislation and have their input put into once it arrives at committee, so that a detailed audit could actually be spelled out. I do support it being referred to committee based upon the issues that surround what I consider a very negative image that Milwaukee has gotten on some of these cases, which have been in error to be reported. So I would hope that my colleagues would support to move it to committee. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Alderman Michael Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. President. My colleagues, I think it makes appropriate sense to send this back to committee. I think Alderwoman Cox raises a very salient point. The scope of the contract will determine the cost of the audit. We should have a debate on that. I know, and thanks to Alderman Dudzik, he shared with me an email he received from the controller, which has a range from $35,000 to $150,000, depending on the scope of services. And in that letter to Alderman Dudzik, the controller himself raises the issue whether he's capable of even performing the audit. So these are issues that should be discussed in committee. In addition, it's not like the Milwaukee Police Department are sitting back and not doing anything. They are. The Milwaukee Police Department are working cooperatively with the FBI on an audit. That audit is going to be released in the next 30 days. In addition, there's an internal audit. We also here at the state of Wisconsin is looking at doing another outside audit. And finally, the Milwaukee Police Department up front has acknowledged they have a problem with the recording system. For people's edification, it was in the budget in 2011 and 12 that we had appropriated over $300,000 to look at upgrading the software for the recording system. At that time, the police department concluded that, in fact, that was not going to be sufficient, that they acknowledged that there was a recording problem, and in fact came back before this council and Capital Improvements Committee, which after an extensive study indicating that they have to improve the whole system extensively, which is nearly a $7.5 million change into the system to be paid for over a 3-year period. Capital Improvement Committee rightfully took this up as a hearing and slowed down the process simply because they want to see if they can reduce the cost. But I think it's important to acknowledge up front, the Milwaukee Police Department knew they had a problem. They were taking actions to correct it. Now that never got reported in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, which is very interesting. And I'll just leave it at that. But at the same time, I think we should examine any concerns that were raised in that story, in those stories, and take them legitimately at as evidence that there is an issue. We should be upfront about it. The Milwaukee policemen acknowledge they have, in fact, recognized there is a problem with recording data, as is with practically every police department in the state, in the country, and they're looking at efforts to correct it. I'm very open to making having transparency and making sure we have the correct data, because it plays a very important role in determining our allocation of resources. But before we just simply make that determination, I think it's important to look at the facts, hear both sides of the story. We have not heard from the police department other than through the media. We haven't afforded them an opportunity to at least testify on those issues. Let's get to the facts first, find out what the cost of the audit, find out perhaps maybe this council may want to go on record calling for the state to do that independent audit. Because quite honestly, I think there'll be people who will look at the controller's audit and say that's another city department auditing. That's unfair. You got a conflict of interest. Maybe it does take a state independent audit, and they can pay the 150 grand or 200 grand to do it. So let's take a breath, get the facts, and move accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Alderman Bob Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think perhaps some of these questions that have been raised by my colleagues might be answered by Alderman Dudzik, so I would defer to him.
Before you do that, I do want to acknowledge the other ones, and then if there's a desire to respond at a later date, then I'll give you the ability to do so.
I understand the procedure.
Thank you. Yes, sir. The chair recognizes Alderman Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think that I should probably wait until Alderman Dudzik speaks.
That's fine, if you'd like. Then
Yeah, I would defer
okay, thank
to
you.
see if he...
Chair recognizes Alderman Kovac and then Alderman Dudzik.
Thank you,
Kovac.
Mr. President. I'm going to support this motion to refer back to committee, I think, for 3 main reasons, one of which has already been stated well by Alderwoman Coggs and restated by Chairman Murphy, that there is an unknown fiscal element that I think before we proceed, we need to at least know what this is going to cost us to do. The second big reason is, before we spend any money, we need to decide whether or not this is a redundant spending of money. Given that in advance of this newspaper article, there was an internal audit going on. Well in advance of this newspaper article, there's also a federal audit, routine federal audit of these numbers. And so certainly combined with those federal resources, our internal resources, and the resources of our local newspaper, which based on following the money and how they devote money, the 2 most important things in this state are the Green Bay Packers and the Milwaukee Police Department, if you look at where they devote their resources. And I think one thing that the committee needs to consider in any audit of this information is not to just cherry pick a few gotcha numbers, which clearly is what I think the newspaper did. A true contextualized report would have looked at the past decade, would have looked at previous police chiefs, would have looked at the fact that this IT system, by the chief's own admission, is not perfect. And in fact, one of the first things the chief did when after he started the job was ask the private business community for help with IT. And there are well-known problems that this council is very familiar with the way police keep track of numbers, in the Milwaukee Police Department in particular. Those problems aren't unique to the Milwaukee Police Department, but they certainly are not something we as a city are proud of. So to the extent that these numbers are off, we need to get them right. But we also shouldn't panic, because we knew the numbers were off. We've been told year after year, these numbers aren't right, we need to fix this overall reporting system. And so for me, any audit needs to contextualize last year's numbers with previous year's numbers, going back several years, to know whether the problem is getting better or worse. Because we know the problem is there. We're not We know the problem's there and we want to fix it, but we need to know, are we fixing it? Are the numbers moving in the direction of more accuracy, or are they getting less accurate? And that is not something that we know from the newspaper report. I hope it's something we're able to find out for ourselves, whether the comptroller, the police department, or the FBI, or the state, or whomever is best able to answer that question, or even the newspaper. If they want to start asking real questions, we would welcome that.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Alderman Dudzik to be followed by Alderman Donovan.
Thank you very much. Let me just put in perspective what the Milwaukee Police Department thought of when it came to this particular IMS system. They did, in fact, ask for funding, but in their list of things that they wanted to accomplish, first and foremost was updates to the police administration building. Second was almost $2.5 million to upgrade the radio and communication system. They put the repairs to the RMS system right below the redesign of the restrooms in the 911 dispatch center. So I'm not exactly sure how much emphasis they are looking for on this particular problem. I guess if somebody's worried about the fact that we're hiring we're outsourcing some audit expertise, I think that that's a pretty common, and Alderman Murphy can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that's a pretty common, or a avenue that has been explored or used in the past with regards to our comptroller's office. Lastly, one of the things that I wanted to get this up and running as quickly as possible is because of the negative image. We're going into a long, hot summer, and I think it's important that, you know, the citizens of the city of Milwaukee realize that their calls for service aren't being miscategorized for whatever reason. And I truly do believe that the primary reason for the errors is probably more because of the Tiburon system that we have, as the chief has indicated in the past, than anything else. And I think that that image of the Milwaukee Police Department misstating or misrepresenting crime stats is something that does this city no service whatsoever. As far as the dollar amount, if somebody wants to add an amendment that we don't exceed $150,000, which is what the top end of the email that I got from Mr. Mattson yesterday would indicate, that's fine. Let's put a cap on it at $150,000. But I want to just remind you that we just a few minutes ago supported the idea of spending in excess of $50,000 for an unknown sculpture. So I don't see this as being a real big issue. Again, we're talking about repairs to the RMS system that over the next few years will cost in excess of $7.5 million. So I appreciate those people that want to put a hold on this. We do a lot of committee work at the council, as anybody that was here from 9 o'clock until 10:30 will understand. But I think that this is something that should go forward sooner rather than later, and that's why I put my name on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alderman. Chair recognizes Alderman Donovan, then we'll go to Alderman Hamilton. Alderman Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Apparently, it's a desire of the council to hold this, or I should say, refer it back to committee. And that's fine, and I understand the arguments. I will probably vote against that because I do feel it needs to go forward immediately. A couple points that I want to make, though. This idea that somehow we've all known that these numbers are wrong is absurd. Up until a month ago, I was chairman of the Public Safety Committee for 8 years. And I was under the impression, along with this entire community, that crime is down, crime is down, crime is down. So this idea that somehow we knew the number were wrong, and yeah, well then why the hell is the chief standing up there along with the mayor and everyone else? Let's get a grip here, come on. I commend the Journal-Sentinel, quite frankly, and I will also say this, Mr. President, and this is the God-spoken truth. Some of us have been hearing concerns about these numbers for a long, long time. From police officers. So Whether this is held or whether it goes back to committee or moves forward now, it is incumbent upon this council. We make monumental decisions every year based on the information that this police department gives us. Staffing issues, budget issues, I know everyone agrees with that. We need to get to the bottom of this. I believe it can and should move forward now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alderman. Chair recognizes Alderman Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to wait until I heard from the sponsors about some of the questions raised by my colleagues here on the floor, but I guess the questions still remain, and I think it's important to move forward in an orderly fashion, and I think it's extremely important to pay attention to the fact that the current chairman of the Public Safety Committee has introduced a communication file to get the information from the internal audit. I think that would give us a lot of information on the direction that we would need to go in.
We could.
And, you know, considering the fact that there may be some financial impacts on this and whether or not we do it internally with the comptroller's office or consider an outside source outside of the city, as Alderman Murphy and Alderwoman Cox brought up, I think it's important for us to be able to have the information that's necessary in order to make that determination and not do it on the fly as the resolution suggests. But of course, I think we all agree with the spirit of the resolution, which is to get to the bottom of these numbers. And I think all of us agree with that. Just don't necessarily agree with actually having an immediate adoption file without having all the information necessary to make this judgment call. So I would support sending it back to committee as well, Mr. President.
Thank you, Alderman. The chair recognizes Alderman Bold and Alderman Kovac.
Mr. President, thank you. I think one of the larger issues that has to be weighed at this point is I don't believe that unless this matter is referred back to committee that it has the votes to pass for immediate adoption, at which point you have no adoption, at which point you have no audit being directed, at which point there is nothing internal and independent. So, I mean, you know, we can look at this from a prideful vantage point of I'm going down with the ship, but the fact is the ship is sinking unless you want to take it in a more prudent and expeditious manner and actually lay out the scope, lay out the costs, and at least that in that way, see, because I have to believe that from the expressions that we're hearing here that a number of additional members support moving forward with an independent audit, but doing so in a manner that is more outlined and more defined rather than just saying all or nothing. So, I mean, to me, that's why I think it's more prudent to send it back. I do support having an outside scope, and I understand what comes internal. I like Alderman Donovan states, I've heard for years, and I mean going back to almost day one, issues of whether we want to talk about it being cook the books in the Milwaukee Police Department when it comes to police records and how police items are being outlined. I really would like something that is independent, but the fact is I think that it is more prudent to actually refer it back to committee, set that scope, and actually have something that has a chance of passing than what I believe today simply would probably garner about 5 or 6 votes, not meet the muster of 2/3, and fail.
That's a valid point. Because it does not expend any resources, it would need 10 votes or 2/3 of the council in order to have it for an immediate adoption. With that, the chair recognizes Alderman Kovac.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to address a couple of phrases that have been tossed around today, like cooking books and fudging data. And if that's really true, if any of these audits reveal that, the vote's going to be 15-0 to not just investigate it, but to fix it immediately, to fix it yesterday. I want to be clear about that. What we're talking about here are inconsistencies in data. And when I said we all knew this was there, that's what I meant. that there are inconsistencies in the data for which there is an acceptable margin of error, and for which it's possible that these discrepancies are outside that margin of error. We don't know yet. There, as far as I know, looking from the outside in, there's three main reasons the police need to collect this data. One is internal and perhaps most important, and that was why the police chief, when he reached out to the private business community, demanded that he get some IT experts in there who weren't just police officers but really understood computers. That's because the data-driven style of policing that Chief Flynn brought to this city, which not just statistically but anecdotally has had an effect on crime in this city. That approach required real-time data. It used to be they had pins in the wall and they had to wait a few weeks to be sure. Now they have real-time computerized data. If that data is not accurate, the police can't do their own job. Okay? They also need data. It needs to be reliable that they hand over to the district attorney. That is also incredibly vital, that the data, the police reports, et cetera, is handed over so that criminals who are caught can be punished properly according to our criminal justice system. There's another reason we need to collect data, so we can turn it over to the feds so they can compare city to city and so we can have really good analysis done. That's probably the third most important. It's important. It's not as important as the first two. And I want to be clear when I say we need to contextualize these numbers. Before we start using phrases, which the newspaper deliberately wanted to imply was the case, before we start talking about fudging numbers or cooking books, I don't know that for a fact that it'd be the case. I sincerely hope it's not the case, and I want to find out if it is. But only looking at 1 year, when we've had 5 years of crime drops, and saying, well, look at this year and crime drop would have been a crime increase. First of all, it's possible that we had crime drop for 4 years and then go up for the 5th year. I mean, I'd like crime to drop to zero, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. Maybe I'm a cynic for thinking crime will never be zero. So we're never going to have reductions. The reductions are not going to continue ad infinitum on forever. At some point, crime is going to go down so far that it comes back up. If it's really true that the 5-year trend isn't true, I want to know that as fast as anybody else wants to know that. But the data that we have in front of us indicates that just in the last year, we were a few percentage points off, which may or may not be within an acceptable margin of error compared to other cities, compared to ourselves. Certainly we want to improve it and get that error margin lowest. But just like crime is never going to be zero, any police department that has hundreds of thousands of contacts with residents and with criminals during the course of any given year, you're never going to have 100% accuracy of the data. So we need to put this in the proper context.
Thank you, Alderman. That well said. Chair recognizes Alderman Davis.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, I don't want to get off into this whole issue about the department purposely cooking the books, because sometimes there are some who agitate and want to create this inflammatory rhetoric that ends up not being very productive. And the reason why I wanted to co-sponsor it, Mr. President, was to make sure that as the governing body here in the city of Milwaukee, any report that we would put together would be referred directly to the Fire and Police Commission that deals with personnel and policy matters on behalf of the Milwaukee Police Department. Because in essence, what we receive is communication file based upon the performance of the department, but at the end of the day, that relationship with the commission and the performance of the commission that we've had discussions like this prior to is important, because this is an issue that they're going to have to address. If in fact personnel is properly trained, properly deployed, properly carrying out the policy within the department. So I would hope that we would send this issue to committee so that we can get various inputs in order for us to make sure that we direct the outcomes of the audit so that they're very specific and defined. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Alderman. Chair recognizes Alderman Perez.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to be recorded as in favor of sending this file back to committee and also co-sponsoring file.
Let the record reflect Alderman Perez's desire to co-sponsor the file. Any objection to those who are sponsoring it? If not, thank you. Chair recognizes Alderman Murphy to be followed by Alderman Wade.
No, I'm not about really to argue with Alderman Kovac, who's a mathematician with a degree from Harvard on the methodology factors. So I'm going to take him here. Quite honestly, he would be much more of an expert on sampling methodology than anyone here on the council, and quite honestly, probably anyone over at the Journal-Sentinel. The reality is every one of us have the same concern, whether you're a sponsor of this legislation or not. We want to get to the truth. We want to get to the bottom line. Are these numbers reflective of a serious problem, or is simply a methodology sampling error? we have an obligation to get to the truth. But we have an obligation also not to just jump every time a reporter calls. We have a responsibility to the public to make sure what the scope of services of that independent audit should be. We have a responsibility to find out what the cost of that audit will be. We have a responsibility to at least hear from the police department in a public hearing about some of the concerns they raise. I've heard from them privately in which they question the methodology of this reporter, and they provide some very interesting analysis, which has never been made public, which I think at least should be out there, at least for hearing the other side. So before we start voting allocation of up to $150,000 without even knowing what exactly we're asking for, I think is irresponsible. That's all we're saying is, let's get to the bottom of this. Send it back to committee, allow for an opportunity for the controller to at least say what is the concerns they have and how it can be done properly, and let us go from there.
Thank you, Alderman. Chair recognizes Alderman Wade.
Mr. President, I guess I opened up this can of worms, so I guess I better close it. Close it. I have one other concern, and my concern is universal, the rest of my colleagues, but my other concern is, I sat on this council for a decent amount of time, and for most of that time, the crime numbers were going up. And my concern is, why didn't the Journal-Sentinel question the smudging and the fixing of the numbers when crime was increasing? And now all of a sudden, when crime is going in a positive direction, they have resources and time and efforts to dispute that or to question it at that time. So I have a question for the local newspaper of exactly what their goals are by taking these steps, because they could have took these same measures when the crimes was going up, and they chose not to do so. So that's a concern that I have also.
Thank you. No further comments at this point in time. Alderman Bowles' motion is to refer back to committee. We're going to take a roll call vote on the motion to refer back to committee, which supersedes the motion to immediately adopt. With that, Madam Chairman, will you please call the roll?
On the item before us to refer file number 120220 back to committee, Alderman Hamilton.
Aye.
Davis.
Aye.
Kovac.
Aye.
Bauman.
Aye.
Bowe.
Aye.
Cogs.
Aye.
Wade.
Aye.
Donovan.
Aye.
Puente.
Excused.
Murphy.
Aye.
Dudzik.
No.
Perez.
Aye.
Utkowski.
Aye.
Zelinski.
Aye.
Mr. President.
Aye.
13 ayes, 1 no, 1 excused.
13 ayes, 1 no, 1 excused. The motion carries. Are there any discussions relative to the other items for immediate adoption? Any discussion on the other items relative to immediate adoption? If not, Alderman Kovac moves for the adoption of these files. Will the city clerk please call the roll?